Hi, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to make a long Stash Buster scarf. The one I'm wearing is about 80 inches long. It has 89 stitches that's knit vertically, and it is roughly 6.5 inches wide, 26 rows. And the green one was 20 rows, 86 stitches, but it's considerably shorter. It's only 73 inches long. And so some of the length will be dependent on how densely you've knit the piece, what kind of yarn you've knit it from. So just be aware that the size is variable. It's garter stitch, so it tends to stretch. So make it wider than you think you'd like, because it tends to stretch out as you're wearing it. And I made them with the same yarn we used in the last video for the cowls. I just separated it out so that this was primarily greens and this was primarily blues. And I like to knit these on something that's 36 inches long, and that way I have enough space. You could get all those stitches on something that's 24, but I like to be able to stretch it out as I'm working to check my mistakes and look at my color combinations. So you can buy these are oak dowels, 36 inches long. They're 1/2 inch dowels, so they're the size of a US 17 needle. Or you can use your 36 inch long purple knitting hoop. You want to cast on and cast off onto bigger pipe, because remember, those edges have to have some stretch and give, otherwise your edge of your scarf will pucker. So you can use one of your extra uprights to cast on, or a long piece of tubing like so over your rod, or you can just use a little cap. And you can also use if you have a mini knitter, you just want to make sure you buy the cap that goes onto that size pipe. And then you insert your rod and glue it into place. You can wrap tape around, as I've showed in previous videos. So to make sure your cap doesn't shift around on there, you can even just use a rubber band on the edge of your pipe. And my scarf incorporated about 13 different kinds of yarn, and you will need about 10 feet for 86 to 89 stitches on for your tail before you make your slip knot. And we're not going to put that many on. I start with a yarn that is, I'm going to say, somewhat durable. I don't usually use any of the eyelash or something scratchy on the outside. I put that in the middle of the scarf. So for mine, I started with one strand of this boussole and one strand of this confetti yarn together. And if some of your rows are knit with something thick and other rows are knit with something very fine, it won't matter, strangely. So you just want to start. I won't do all 10 whole feet, but that's what you would need for a normal scarf. And you want to make your slip knot. And I just used a slingshot cast on, but you want to make sure that you make it loosely, because, as I said, otherwise your scarf will pucker. So just as we've done in the past. And as you put your stitches on, they'll slide back off of the cap, and that's fine. And you can see how loose that is, and that's just the way you want it. Now, you can go ahead and knit that first row with your cast on pieces if you want. And that's what we'll do. We'll take sure we don't have the tail here. Excuse me. And my blue scarf was 26 rows, and I knit every odd number. In other words, when I was working from right to left, I used front stitches. Now you want to make sure, see how big and loose these stitches are. You want to make sure that you have both strands as you're bringing it through, and that you're only piping the new stitch. Otherwise, it's easy to accidentally bring up the cast on stitch too, and you want to make sure you don't do that. Okay, so now I only put 5 stitches on there, but it doesn't matter. Now what I do at the end of every row is I go ahead and cut my working yarn and leave yourself about 10 inches. Now, if you want to know what you did for your first row, because it helps to sort it later if you make a mistake and you have to go back, way back down into the scarf, just cut yourself a little smidge. And take a piece of tape and then stick that on your notebook right next to you. And then you know that your first row were, those two yarns held together. Now, here's your tail from your first row, and you're going to add on something else. Now, let's say you want to put your eyelash in. Your eyelash is going to need a companion because this can be kind of fragile in some cases, and it's hard to knit with just this. So just mix in something that, otherwise maybe wouldn't look so hot, like this piece of acrylic worsted. Toss it down in your barrel and get your ends evened up. And then hold those so they're basically the same length. You can trim these later, so you can always leave a little, leave it longer than you plan. And make an overhand knot and make sure you have all 4 of those strands as you bring it through. Now, don't tighten this loop up yet. You want to put it into position. And you don't want to push it up too close to the rod. Give yourself a little wiggle room because you don't want to make this stitch too tight. So make sure that you're making your overhand knot out a bit, ½ inch or so. Now, you're going to go ahead and backstitch this row. So you can leave your yarn up here, the working yarn, and take off your first stitch. And when I'm working a long row of stitches and they're all the same, I like to keep my yarn in one place. And we're going to backstitch. And then take this off and just slip it onto your finger. And the working yarns are against my finger. And I'm just hooking it with my index finger. Make sure you have both. Make sure your yarn is loose in your bin. So you knit every other row and backstitch every other row. So now I've knit my second row, and I'm going to go ahead and cut it, and I'm going to make myself a little doodah, because this will end up looking so mixed up as you're knitting, and the stitches are so loose you can lose track. I actually started this video once and I lost track myself and I had to restart. Now, let's say you have some ribbon yarn. I don't like to use this out on the very edge because it tends to be scratchy. Some people just put it into their fringe, but I like to knit a row or two if I want a little glamour in there, but not too much. And again, you want to just leave your end long enough that it's even with the tail from the previous row. Now you have 3 pieces, the 2 pieces from the previous row and the new ribbon yarn. And make an overhand knot. It doesn't really matter the order of the colors. If I have something strong in the color category, I'll put a couple, but not near each other. I space them out across the scarf. So let that be your guide. So you want to make sure, again, that you don't have that knot up. I got that knot up a little too close. You can pull it back down a bit. Again, this is going to be a front stitch row, so you want to take off the first stitch and front stitch that. And this ribbon yarn has a lot of take up, so when you're using the ribbon yarn, you might need 22 feet for a row. This is a great way to use up scraps of yarn or handmade, hand spun yarn if you don't have a lot of it and you want it to really stand out in the piece. Each row needs to be roughly, you're going to need roughly 20 feet to 22 feet for each row, depending on how bulky the yarn is and how many strands you're holding together. I prefer to cut it at the end and then there's less waste. But save all your waste, because if you have a blending board, you can combine all that waste yarn and make new yarn. So, if you're a spinner. So now I've knit that, and I'm going to go ahead and cut it. Make sure you're only cutting the yarn that you just knit with. let's knit with something else now. So let's just say you have this and it's fairly bulky. You know, you might want to use this by itself. Just what we did. Hold it up and tie those two ends together. I didn't put my ribbon on my pad over there. I'll have to do that. Okay, so there's my... And again, when you're using this ribbon yarn, it can be a little bit tricky because the ribbon yarn, especially if you have them packed onto shorter rod and you're not using something that's 36 inches long, they'll stack up on each other and it'll be easy to take off more than you want. So put your little ribbon yarn thing over there so you know that's what you did. And this is a back stitch row. And take your yarn off, your stitch off, and pull your new yarn through. Whoops. Make sure he doesn't fall off. These are going to be looser than, you know, the last scarf we made. So it could be a little trickier to make sure you only have one stitch and to make sure you have all your strands if you're using multiple strands for your row. Now when you have so many stitches on one row and you notice a mistake somewhere, you know, I like to stretch it out from time to time and check to make sure I haven't dropped a strand. If you have, you know, just take a you know, stitch marker and mark that column of stitches so that you can just knit over to it the next time. Don't try to undo what you've just done, especially if it's way back there, but you want to try to correct your mistakes as soon as they happen, and that way you won't get mixed up about where you're at. So when you go to make your next row then, you know, and mix up your colors so that you have, they don't have to be exact matches. Again, you're just going to take your two strands, and every time, I like to change it every row because then my fringe is already done. Again, leave yourself a little bit of a gap so that it isn't too tight when you make your next stitch. So, now here comes your stitch marker, and this was the column, say, that you made a mistake. So take this off, and it's just like before. Hold that up and take a look at it. Now we know that on every other row, you know, we change every row. One row we knit or front stitch, one row we back stitch. When I hold this blue strand up, I know that I had done this as a back stitch. How? Because that ribbon yarn is on the back. So let's say I had dropped the eyelash on this row right here where the blue and the purple. So I can undo this and I undo this. And let's say it was the eyelash I had dropped and it was just hanging free. Put it back together with the blue. And how had I done that stitch? That was a back stitch. So I know this has to go in as a front stitch. And the next one has to come in as a back stitch. If you lose your place or you're confused, refer to your little, because when it's all different kinds like this, and there's a lot of texture, and it's hairy, it can be hard to see your rows and know exactly where you're at, especially if you've made a mistake in two rows, and you want to make sure you don't cross things up. So, and then once you've fixed it, then you can just go ahead and knit it, or front stitch it, because that's the row you're working on. So if you want to make yourself a little reference, and also if you wanted to recreate the same scarf. Now, do not cast off. If you cast, let's say this, if you cast off from this side to this side, you're going to end up with more fringe on one end than you will the other if you cast off on here. But it's not really very noticeable unless your scarf were to be very narrow. So I'm just going to do one more row just to show you where you should really cast off. And Let's see if I have enough of this yarn here. So again, we'll do one more row of back stitches. Even yarn that isn't very pretty sometimes, once you've combined it in these scarves, will give it a whole new look. Now sometimes I do my last row and my cast off with the same yarn. If you want to, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if your scarf looks symmetrical in terms of what yarn you started the scarf and ended with. And now we're going to cast off. But to cast off, remember, we have to put our little cap back on with our rubber band, because we want to make sure that that's loose. So all you have to do is get the knots out of your rubber band and put your cap back on. And again, you could use the same yarn you cast on with if you wanted, especially if you're going to knit a row of it, because it'll give sort of a border, but you don't have to do that. The nice thing about this scarf is it kind of lets you be an artist without actually spinning the yarn together. But you're going to tie this on the same way as you did all the other ones. So pick up your tail, tie those three together, put your knot on there, but not too close to the pipe. Give yourself some space. And now you're just going to cast off in pattern. So do this as a front stitch. And put it on the cap. And again, we're going to do this loosely, so you want to make two. And then cast the first stitch made over the second one. Pull that over and make another. Oh. Hang on here, get back on there, you little devil. I'm holding this off to the side, so it's a little trickier than usual. And cast that off. Make sure you're not making these too tight. Make sure you only have the stitch you're knitting. And cast that off. Now you have one stitch left up on your pipe. Go ahead and cut this to the length that's going to be part of your fringe. And now just pull this through that cast off. And now, of course, it's very miniature. Here is your tails. Now, you can make these all the same length. You can make some a little shorter. You can even bead some of these ones that are very plain. If it looks like it's going to unravel, like even some of this boucle does, make sure you put a little knot in the end of that. Because what this boucle is, it's wrapped with a fiber. And if that unravels, it'll come apart. And you do the same thing on the other side. Now, your cast on is the only one where that's not really knotted through there. If it's long enough, you can leave it alone and just tie your knot at the top, and that's part of your fringe. And sometimes a yarn doesn't make a very good fringe. If you don't want your eyelash hanging there, for example, you can cut it off close to the knot and not have it as part of your fringe. And again, if it's something that's going to unravel, make sure you tie a little knot in it. These single ply yarns will almost always unravel, so I tie a little knot in the end. And that's how you make a beautiful Stash Buster scarf. It'll take you a couple of hours because you're making a lot of stitches, but it's a lot of fun and it gives you a chance to be an artist. Thanks for watching.